The following is a presentation of the ILR School at Cornell University. ILR, advancing the world of work.
Hi, welcome everybody. My name is Jeff Cowie. I'm one of the founding faculty members of the History of Capitalism initiative that is sponsoring this event, as well as the chair of the Labor Relations Law and History Department here at the ILR School. And before we get going, I want to say a few very important thanks, one of which is to Rana right back there, the admin for the department, who has taken on way more responsibility than anybody should have to. My co-conspirators in the History of Capitalism, Lou Hyman and Ed Baptist over here. J.C. Bell, our undergraduate assistant, who's going to help with the microphone. And most importantly, a big shout out to the boss, Dean Katz of the ILR School, who has made such a wonderful home for the History of Capitalism as it's getting going, and just a great place to work. So we're here to discuss this book you may have somehow heard about. Thomas Piketty's Capital in the 21st Century. And what we want to do is have relatively brief presentations from our esteemed panel here, and then open it up for what I hope will be a very vigorous, robust series of discussions. And I also want to invite the panelists to ask each other questions as we go. I often get frustrated at these events that some of the smartest folks in the room aren't talking to each other. So real quickly, I want to plug the History of Capitalism initiative. It's in its infancy. Hopefully it will be in its I can't even say it. Shortly, but we have a MOOC that you may have come across. We have a summer camp and training for people in the History of Capitalism methods. We have a big conference in the fall. So there's a lot of exciting things going around, and you're welcome to sign up to learn more about that. So I want to begin, I have 1 foot in political economy and 1 foot in cultural history, and I think one of the more interesting things about this book is actually the cultural phenomenon of the book. It has actually replaced Disney's Journey to the Ice Palace as the #1 book on Amazon. The author's been compared to Tocqueville, Marx, Keynes. The New York Times did a piece on IT intellectuals, comparing him with Susan Sontag, Christopher Lasch, Alan Bloom, our own Francis Fukuyama. Constantly referred to as a rock star scholar, which is sort of ironic because he wears these little, V-neck sweaters and looks like he's fresh out of grad school. And the reception has been of the book, Invasion into the U.S. has even been compared to Beatlemania. There's a Twitter feed, if you want to get in on it, that you can help decide whether Pikketty is hot or not. The reviews have been, there's some seats up front again. The reviews have been extraordinary. One reviewer said that it's going to change both the way we think about society and the way we do economics. Another referred to it as a fearsome beast of analysis stuffed with an awesome amount of empirical data. Yet another, a political and theoretical bulldozer. And of course, that means the Pikketty bubble is about to burst and the backlash is about to ensue. And my favorite sort of hyperbole on hyperbole comes from Bloomberg, which is, this is the most important book ever, and it's also all wrong. So I'm excited to be here. For my own issues, I'm a labor historian by trade. I find this book to be a fascinating sort of intellectual moment in the sense that here it is, a book coming out in 2014 by a French economist talking about inequality, and it starts off with a strike story in South Africa where 34 workers are killed in a platinum mine strike. And then it never proceeds to mention organized labor, unions, or other forms of social bargaining really for the rest of the book. And unions and labor are not in the index. So it's sort of an interesting sort of intellectual moment with that. Today our panel is going to be a little bit US-centric, I think, perhaps highly. And I think that's for the better, because I think there's some interesting challenges here for the author and how the US model fits in here. So without further ado, let me introduce our panelists. I'm going to introduce everybody at once so that we can, once the ball is rolling, I don't have to get up here and interrupt that. At one point, Pikketty refers to economists' quote, childish passion for mathematics and for purely theoretical and often highly ideological speculation. This does not describe our first speaker, Robert Frank, the Henrietta Johnson Lewis Professor of Management and Professor of Economics at Cornell's Johnson Graduate School of Management. You may know him in addition to his many outings for his Economic View column in the New York Times. He has many notable papers, of course, in all the leading journals, but probably most known for his many very readable books, Choosing the Right Pond, Passions Within Reason, Microeconomics and Behavior, Principles of Economics, with an obscure co-author named Ben Bernanke, Luxury Fever, What Price the Moral High Ground, Falling Behind, The Winner-Take-All Society, The Economic Naturalists, and most recently, The Darwin Economy. So an extraordinary resume of books that I think will add greatly to what we have to talk about today. Our second panelist on the end, Ed Baptist, is from the Cornell History Department. And Pikketty also makes a lot of comparisons between the 19th and 21st centuries. And I think Ed will be particularly valuable in guiding our way through that. Ed studies the 19th century United States, and particularly the study of enslavement of African Americans and the expansion of slavery in the United States between the Constitution in 1787 and the Civil War. And his first book was called Creating the Old South, Middle Florida's Plantation Before the Civil War. And his forthcoming opus in September. Available now. Pre-order. Oh, pre-order, okay. Perhaps it too will beat out Disney's Ice Princess or whatever. The Half Has Never Been Told, Slavery and the Making of American Capitalism. Something that I also think our author can be challenged on. Ed is also part of, or the mastermind behind Freedom on the Move, a digital history project on runaway slaves. He was part of the History of Capitalism MOOC, and he's also House Professor Dean of Carl Becker House on West Campus. Another thing I like about this book, making the transition to our third speaker, is the intellectual range of the book. I mean, how many economists invoke Balzac and Jane Austen and Zola? And range is, I think, something Aziz Rana brings to the table. An associate professor of Cornell at the Cornell Law School. He also has a PhD in political science, a JD from Yale Law School. And his first book is called The Two Faces of American Freedom, which situates the American experience within the global history of colonialism, emphasizing how notions of republicanism and expansionism have shaped U.S. law and politics since the founding. The book has tremendous breadth. I can attest to that. And he's also a public intellectual, having published in a variety of outlets, the New York Times, The Nation, Salon.com, CNN.com, and the like. So I urge you to join me in welcoming our three panelists, and you're up first, Bob.
Thank you, Jeff, for the generous remarks and for organizing this event. I think it's fair to say that if you had organized a panel on inequality 5 years ago, the room would be mostly empty as opposed to all the seats being taken. I've been writing about inequality for maybe 30 years now. For most of that time, I think it's not a self-deprecating remark to say nobody paid much attention to anything I was writing about inequality. I'm a huge fan of this book and would be even if I weren't interested personally in the subject of inequality. It's a really quite awesome book. The first review that Jeff read I recognized as having come from Paul Krugman in the New York Review of Books, the one that said it would change the way we think about society and the way we do economics. Paul Krugman, those of you who don't follow him, is not given to idle praise for work done by others that he didn't get there first on. The book is fantastic, but mainly I'm so excited about it because I get to sort of grab hold of his coattails and get some more attention for this important subject that I've been trying to argue about. I did a piece in Slate. It's coming up on 3 years ago now. Why is inequality rising? What are the consequences of it? And should we and could we do anything about it? Nobody would have clicked on that piece 5 years ago, but because of Emmanuel Saez and Thomas Piketty and the work they did, the really painstaking work they did, constructing long series of data on the incomes earned by not the top 20%, but the top 1% in society. The Occupy movement was spawned by that. Not too many people knew who Pikketty and Saez were at the time. But for their work, there wouldn't have been any outrage about what the top 1% was walking away with. And those pieces that I did in Slate were the most widely read, widely shared pieces in Slate the week they were published. That never, ever would have happened. I was invited yesterday to speak on the subject of inequality to the Ithaca Neighborhood Housing Services annual meeting. I can guarantee you that never would have happened 5 years ago. And somebody asked me after the book, I mentioned after the event, since I'd mentioned the book in Pat, why is everybody so excited about the Pikketty book? And I thought it was a great question, and it's not the 1% news. I think that news had filtered out long before the book got into print. They had some good work on that back in the early 2000s. The real thing that I think has sparked people's attention in this book is the claim that the formerly rosy view about the time path of inequality as it evolves in capitalist societies, that optimistic view due largely to Simon Kuznets, a pioneer in gathering data about the incomes of the people at the top of the income distribution, rather than being an accurate portrayal of any general tendency in capitalism, Pikketty argues very persuasively that it describes what happens during a period that was, by almost any reckoning, an anomaly in our history. It was a period during which the rate of growth of the economy was very rapid, and the rate of return to the holders of capital was unusually low. And when the rate of growth of the economy is much greater than the rate of return to capital, we do see a tendency over time for things to equalize. As he's gone back and constructed more than 2 centuries of data for France, a long time series for the US and the UK, and now a host of other countries, it's become clear that for most of the history that we can reconstruct, the rate of return on capital has been significantly higher than the rate of growth of the economy. And his forecast, which is plausible enough, nothing certain what things will look like 20, 30 years out, but I find his forecast persuasive, is that the rate of return on capital will stay materially above the rate of economic growth, which will slow, already has slowed since the early 1970s. And under those conditions, we get a rich get richer dynamic because the incomes from capital, when capital is very highly concentrated, don't tend, for the most part, to be spent. You can only spend so much out of hundreds of millions of dollars of annual income. And so the pyramid tends to get steeper and steeper, and that has all sorts of undesirable consequences, not least the ability of people at the top to buy political favors. I think much of what's gone awry in the US, now recently reinforced by Supreme Court decisions, has been the purchase of legislation that rich people think is favorable to them. The Koch brothers may be only the most example. There's a whole lot of PAC money chasing after lax regulations and lower tax rates for people at the top of the income ladder. If there's time, I'll give you a hint about why I think they've made a stupid bargain. That even if you're very wealthy, the package you get under that set of changes in the laws that they've managed to impose on the rest of the system is quite unfavorable to their interests, more broadly construed. But set that aside for the moment. The one major quarrel I have with the book is, as it applies to the U.S., it's not correct to say that most of the increase in inequality in the U.S. has come about through massive inheritance. That was the mechanism throughout the Belle Epoque in Europe, and maybe even more important in Europe now than here in the U.S. Here, it's primarily been the rise of astronomically high salaries. I think Pikketty is wrong about why we've seen astronomically high salaries. In his view, it's because of a lack of competition. The CEOs appoint their cronies to their boards of directors. Their cronies give them cozy compensation packages, and everything goes on without a whimper. Okay, that happens. Ross Johnson at RJR Nabisco was a horrible CEO. He spent the shareholders' money very unwisely. Had an Air Force that he ferried people around to golf tournaments with pros that were kept on retainer. RJR was bought out by KKR, the private equity firm, and Ross Johnson was fired. There didn't used to be private equity hawks prowling around for opportunities like that. So if you've got a CEO who's not worth the big pay package and is managing the company poorly, yeah, there were interlocking directorates back in the old days. I remember hearing that term as a boy. There are fewer of them now, and the CalPERS, Vigilant Shareholders movement, is a much more rigid form of discipline on malfeasance in the corporate suite. There's a simpler explanation for the big salaries. It's that corporate managers now are promoted in a spot market in the U.S. The signal case was Lou Gerstner, who had been the turnaround artist at RJR, again, interestingly. He showed that a man with no particular experience in the industry could come in and with general management talent could transform a big organization and put it on a path toward vastly higher profitability. IBM at the time was struggling. They said, all right, look, nobody would ever think to hire a tobacco guy to run IBM, but we've got technical people for the tech stuff. He can motivate employees. He's good at finance. He's good at marketing. And so they took a plunge on him. They gave him a huge package with a lot of vested interest in the company, and it paid off big time for shareholders. It was a major turnaround at IBM. The company had been struggling. It reversed its fortunes entirely. So if you can identify talent, and if you can put talent in a job where it has a lot of leverage, it's just unimaginable to think how big the gains are from doing that. Think about our President David Skorton running a $4 billion capital campaign. What if he's 2% better than the next best president would have been? I think he's probably 10% better than the next best president would have been. We're talking about, if it's 10%, we're talking about what, $400 million extra bottom line for Cornell. He's paid a tiny fraction of that. So if you're really good and you're in a position that has enormous leverage, you're worth a fortune. And I think in the U.S. now, the salaries are coming to be bid up to the actual value of the key players within organizations that contribute on that level. They haven't stopped escalating. There's a lot more room for that to play out. Are there CEOs who aren't worth a nickel? Sure. Every company tries to hire the best CEO. There's a going rate in each category. And so I think all hires are made with hope about the future. CEOs today, when they don't pan out, are fired in short order. And then we look for the next superstar CEO. But as soon as you find one that works, you've got that extra little bit of 2% better decisions leveraged out over such a big base. So these salaries are not anti-meritocratic, I think, on the whole. The market is way more competitive than it used to be. You have to shop for your talent in spot markets now. Not all CEOs are hired from the outside, but enough of them are that there really is a competitive market. And we know who the good ones are better than we used to. The information is much richer. The metrics enable you to make assessments about causality. And the packages are still wildly inefficient and in flux, but to think about that as the result of absence of competition rather than a concomitant of additional competition as the market becomes ever more competitive, I think is to miss the essence of what's going on there. Fortunately, it doesn't matter. If you had a much more steeply progressive tax on the income of super managers, they would not, as they threaten to do, stop coming in on Fridays. Think about a big corporation with 40 vice presidents, each of them eager to become CEO. Are they going to play golf on Friday if the tax rate goes up on the highest incomes? What a odd conception of reality these people have when they offer scenarios like that. I don't particularly like the proposal that Pikketty makes to have a more steeply progressive income tax. So if that were the only instrument available to me, I'd take it. Much better, I don't have time to explain, but much better would be a far more steeply progressive tax on consumption. Tax the difference between income and savings, and you'll steer resources in a much more sensible way. The annual tax on wealth, I think that will scare people out of their nightshirts. A much easier idea to accept would be a robust estate tax, which would accomplish many of the same objectives. And if I think about being taxed after I'm dead, I don't worry nearly as much about that as thinking about having to write an additional annual check to the IRS based on how much I've managed to save. And we don't want to discourage savings in the first place. So again, an utterly fantastic book. It's overflowing with concerns and insights about the good of the planet, and not infected in the least bit with the excessive formalism disease that has plagued so much of economics. So if you haven't read it, and I haven't fully read it, I'm through major parts of it, but it's a long book and it's not all easygoing. I urge you to pick up a copy. You don't have to be a professional economist to get full value out of reading this book.
All right, thanks. I wish somebody had told me about the dress code. I heard I was going to be up here with an economist and somebody with a JD and so on, and I was a little worried. It's just a mere historian. Usually, it's enough of a victory for us to put on pants. So anyway, here I am. All right. So I'm going to hit on three main points that I think develop and hopefully reveal for you some things that my engagement with this incredibly lucid and productive book will have generated for me, and perhaps it'll generate some discussion here. The first thing I want to talk about is its impact and likely influence on history as a discipline, though I know we also have a lot to say about its discussions of policy and its implications for future policy. Well, as Bob pointed out and as Jeff pointed out, the key point in the historical understanding that informs Pikketty's work is that R is greater than G over the long run and usually in the short run, except for a few very interesting exceptions. And R being the return to capital, G being the growth of income. And this points us in different directions in our historical inquiries than we have perhaps pointed before. So most discussions about equality and inequality among historians, and I think among others, people who talk about policy and the present as well, have usually focused, and it wasn't wrong to focus on these things, but they've usually focused on formal political rights, on civil rights and questions of access, or on income. Income inequality, until recently, has dominated most economic policy discussions about equality and justice. The same has largely been true for historical discussions of justice and injustice, except perhaps for the history of U.S. slavery. Now, the massive information and analysis which Pikketty presents so lucidly will launch, I think, many investigations into exactly this, the history of wealth, because that suggests new interpretations that challenge existing interpretations. And many of those existing interpretations, Pikketty slyly suggests, have been either written by or heavily influenced by comfortable winners. So these include some of the possible investigations that can come out of this for historians include the project of upending the story of the U.S. as a unique space of social mobility. He concedes that this was, by certain measures, the case for the 19th century. But for the 20th century, he is much less sure, especially when you control for population growth, and I would add for race. For Pikketty, the 20th century U.S. had overall less social mobility than Western Europe. In fact, although I didn't read the footnotes closely enough to see if he cited Jeff Cowie and Nick Salvatore, it sounds quite a bit, in fact, like the story of the long exception. That fits very neatly into his overall picture. He also, and the whole book is full of these insights and these possible directions one can follow that really, for the historian, make it really sparkle as a read. For instance, he upends the accounts of cultural history that designate the 1800 to 1860 era as romantic, and the post-1945 era as cynical in Western culture, and in fact suggests that when you look at how people relate to the economy and think about how that shapes or doesn't shape social distinction, and think in particular about wealth, that in fact you can make a case that the opposite is true, that the 1800 to 1860 era is the cynical one and our more recent era is the more romantic one. I think that's really, really fascinating. And he upends the account of inherited wealth as a shrinking factor in the creation of social class throughout the West over time, and instead argues that it follows, with some lag time, the same U-shaped curve as wealth in general that he identifies. So he sees wealth as increasing relative to national income in virtually all of the Western countries up until 1914, where in particular in Western Europe you have a decline which then begins to build back again after 1945. So that's that U-shaped curve, and he argues that despite our ideas about greater social mobility, and he concedes some ground to them, but he argues that despite that, what we're seeing since the 1980s in particular is the return of inherited wealth as a major factor in shaping our policy, our politics, and our society and culture. All right, so let me move to the second thing I want to talk about. I'm a historian of slavery in the U.S. South, and so as you might imagine, I think he should say more about those things. He doesn't say so much about those things, especially in terms of the figures he presents. He doesn't say so much after 1810. What he identifies is that in 1810, the presence of slavery, of enslaved human beings as a form of capital, a form of productive capital, in the accounting sense, but also in the broader senses that we could understand wealth in, that this makes the U.S. South far more inegalitarian overall than the U.S. North. And he's certainly not fundamentally wrong on that. But he doesn't carry this story forward through the great expansion of cotton production and the great expansion of slave population and the great expansion of the geographic U.S. South that follows 1810. So I did a little work with my own figures and my own stats. And what I found for the 19th century South was that indeed the U.S. South continued to be, and in some ways became even more like Western Europe, as Western Europe's process of industrialization and processes of capital accumulation increased the relative disproportion between wealth and income and increased the capital share as an overall portion of yearly income. The same thing happened in the U.S. South. In fact, by the 1850s, wealth in the U.S. South was 5.5 times the income of the U.S. South. Very similar to Western Europe, maybe 100, maybe 1.0 lower, let's put it that way, but far closer to Western Europe than it was to the northern U.S. And the capital share of income rose to 40%. It was actually slightly higher than in Western Europe. And so the U.S. South in some ways was more like Western Europe than it was like the northern U.S. in 1860, and in some ways was also more like the U.S. and Western Europe in 2014 than was the northern United States in 1860. The return to capital was far, far higher in the South because Southern enslavers had in their possession enslaved human beings whose labor productivity in the production of cotton, the world's most widely traded commodity in the 19th century, had increased 400% in 60 years. So that was why the value of enslaved human beings accounted as capital increased dramatically and pushed U.S. enslavers to the same sort of position as the top 19th century European wealth cohorts. And that dynamic, of course, reflects and structures the dynamics of a radically inegalitarian society. Now, this society, as Pikketty predicts for our own future, went to great lengths to resist fundamental redistribution of wealth. First, by trying to create a legitimizing ideology. Second, when that process was insufficient, by turning to mass violence. Pikketty could perhaps say more about the historical politics of that as a force implemented in the effort to prevent pressure for redistribution, which is another way of saying we should look at 1914 a little more closely. But at last, there was disaster and defeat for the Southern elites. On their scale, Southern enslavers saw a loss of wealth that might have been greater than we could say was suffered by 1914 European elites, looking back from the perspective of 1945. But the nature of the process of emancipation and Reconstruction in the U.S. is a major factor in pushing the U.S. towards more inegalitarian levels of wealth after 1865. There was no redistribution of land. Newly emancipated people were deliberately pushed into low-wage labor and their possible coalitions with other laborers, which might have pushed towards more egalitarian, more redistributive policies, were deliberately blocked. So that is the last important point when we think about slavery in the U.S. South. Disasters that drown capital can lead to more egalitarian periods where growth is greater than returns to capital, G is greater than R, but they don't necessarily have to. So that takes me to my final major point, Piketty's warnings about the future, which are dark enough. He warns of no limit to wealth increases, no limit to the increasing power of the top centile, the 1% of the wealth distribution, which will surely, he repeatedly warns, lead to weakened social mobility and also perhaps lessen growth. And that in turn will put elites legitimizing ideologies to severe tests, which said ideologies will eventually fail. Had he also seriously included the threat of climate collapse, the warnings would be even darker. But the differences between the outcomes of emancipation and Reconstruction in the U.S., which led to this continued concentration of wealth, and what we see in post-1945 Western Europe, where we have a period of greater egalitarianism, should remind us that egalitarian outcomes are not a necessary consequence of disasters that destroy enough financial and real assets to potentially resort the distribution of wealth in societies or even globally. Even his preferred road, the move towards a global progressive tax on wealth, will not necessarily lead to more egalitarian outcomes unless those who are committed to such outcomes are mobilized to attain and maintain political control over the process. For me, the present and recent past have been good reasons to study the hell without fires that enslaved people called their super exploitation on the 19th century South's cotton frontiers. And the near future perhaps is a good reason for us all to pay greater attention to the history of Reconstruction in both the late 19th century U.S. and post-1945 Europe. Thank you.
So for my comments, I think I'm actually going to sit here. That's okay. And I guess the first thing I'd like to say is thank you to Jeff for the invitation, everybody that was involved in organizing this panel. I'm very excited to be here. And it is really a wonderful book and actually quite accessible in various ways. And so I highly urge everyone who hasn't had the opportunity to try to work through it and read as much of it as possible. I think for my comments, what I'm going to focus on is Piketty's solution. And I should also first say that I'm still not sure how to pronounce his name, so apologies to him and also to native French speakers, but I'm going to go with Pikketty, and perhaps I can be corrected in Q&A. So I'm going to focus on Piketty's solution. And as Bob was mentioning, the solution basically is a progressive, though relatively low, global tax on capital, something that he admits, and his sort of this has been part of the conversation about it, that he admits is quite utopian. And what he's, I guess, thinking of is a partial step towards something like a progressive global tax are domestic and regional policies, taxation policies that focus on very high, what he calls confiscatory tax rates on corporate and individual income, on estate, and also progressive, though much lower tax rates for capital. And one of the things that's perhaps most interesting to me as a student of American history and American law was that in the middle of the book, he says that part of the inspiration for the focus on taxation policy has to do with the actual experience in the U.S. That the U.S., in fact, in the mid-20th century pioneered very high marginal tax rates for the top earners, both when it comes to income and also estate. And so he sees this moment as an opportunity to revive in some way policies from the past, so that our contemporary utopia, if anything, is a return to what had been bread and butter taxation policies for the better part of 3 decades in this country. And so what I'd like to do is talk a little bit about the rise and fall of high, or what he calls confiscatory tax rates in this country, and what that suggests for the present about let's say, the strengths, but also real weaknesses of focusing on taxation as a kind of silver bullet that can solve the problems of economic inequality. So let's take a look at what the country, what the basic tax policy was in the US in the 1940s. So Pikketty says in 42, in the early 1940s, the highest marginal tax rate for income was 88%. Tax policy also closed much of the loopholes that had previously existed, and so in practice what this meant was a marginal tax rate of 94, even 95%. I mean, that's incredibly high by comparison with the kind of policies we have today. So you can even think of, let's say, the Obama policies that have been marked at attempting to reach the 1% that really basically still in the 30s. For estate tax, what was the highest marginal estate tax? 77%. You also had incredibly high marginal tax rates for corporate income. And so this is, again, the bread and butter of taxation policy. And what it did is that it essentially smashed the great industrial fortunes that had taken a century to build in this country, the fortunes of folks like Vanderbilt and Rockefeller. And against the backdrop of the Great Depression, the shocks produced by the Great Depression, the shocks produced by World War II, and also the tremendous amount of economic production and productivity that the post-World War II period generated, you had far greater economic equality in this country than what had previously preceded it. And so this is what Pikketty and others would refer to as either, let's say, in terms of Jeff and Nick, the long exception, or like the golden age of American capitalism. So what generated both the political will among political elites, but also the public pressure to actually produce policies like this? And I think the first thing to say is it had a lot to do with the dramatic forms of industrialization that took place in the late 19th, early 20th century, and the ways in which this industrialization produced really high modes of economic inequality. Now, Pikketty is quick to say that actually the economic inequality in the US in the late 19th, early 20th century was not nearly as high as what you saw in Europe, but was significantly higher among white males, and this is the key point that Ed was making, than what had previously been the norm. And it also cut against basic kind of social values and expectations about American life, the ways in which the US was supposed to be distinctive from Europe. So unlike the feudal practices that marked Europe and the class conflict that marked Europe, the US was supposed to be marked by social equality, a basic commitment to a set of Republican values that were tied to rapid and easy social mobility, a cultural practice of social equality where everyone essentially treated each other as equals in public and private life, and also economic independence, which shouldn't be underestimated. The notion that individuals were supposed to be free laborers that controlled the conditions of their own production. In other words, that they enjoyed individual proprietorship, they had farmsteads. If you're engaged in wage labor was on terms that you yourself determined, both when it came to when you're going to start, when you're going to stop, the conditions of productivity. And all of these basic features were under real threat, and they produced a climate of intense conflict around questions of labor and class. And in this context, one of the focal points, let's say, of class disagreement and class consciousness was the status of the super rich. It should be noted that this wasn't the only focus. Actually, class politics was much more expansive than just a concern with what Pikketty or the folks in Occupy would call the 1%. But there was still nonetheless a real focus on the super rich, in large part because the super rich, marked by, let's say, these new rising industrial fortunes, seem to embody precisely the concerns about feudalism that struck at the core of American Republican principles. So you had the growth of massive new fortunes that were tied in various ways to dynastic goals. So again, the Rockefellers, the Vanderbilts, so work on this has been done by Mike McGurr, who's a great historian, but also Sven Beckert, that these were families that were very much interested in maintaining fortunes as families. So improvising American ways of essentially having European-style primogenitors. They're really low estate taxes, so you can essentially hand over your entire fortune to your eldest son. You place your elder sons as chairmen of the board on your company, so that the company is actually a family company. You create a kind of culture around the corporation that itself is tied to aristocracy. So you have palaces that take up blocks in New York City. You engage in, vacation practices where you don't just go to Newport, Rhode Island, but you go to Europe. There's an Anglophilia that marks this particular moment in American history. And all of it suggests an American attempt to essentially imagine a politics of feudalism that's tied to industrialization. And in this context, in the first third of the 20th century, there are a set of policies that are meant to essentially eliminate incipient forms of aristocracy in the country, and that they're tied to all of the big social movements: populism, progressivism, the labor movement, which by the time we get to the Great Depression, the early days of the New Deal, really has tremendous political clout, because with industrialization, workers can actually bring a halt to industrial productivity, can place direct pressure on the nature of the economy at the site of production. And part of the policies that are being pursued are taxation policies, so that there's arguments about progressive taxation that go back to the progressive period, but also to populism. But a variety of other types of policies that are meant to transform the structure of the economy to ensure that industrialization is compatible with democracy. And so these include, we can think about the pluses and minuses of them, but the point is that taxation policy is not alone. It's part of, let's say, an infrastructure of potential options. So you have nationalization calls, you have arguments for basic income, you have arguments for cheap access to credit, like the sub-treasury plan that was pressed by the populists, where you'd actually be able to facilitate, if not individual homesteading, but farmers' cooperatives through easy government-funded credit. And so there are a variety of different policies. There's the incipient calls for full employment that becomes another strong argument. There's arguments about collective bargaining and the right to strike. And one thing to note about basic income, full employment, right to strike, all of these were meant to work in tandem as ways of strengthening the bargaining power of laborers, so that the decision about whether or not to work was not one that was based on necessity, but instead actually represented personal choice, and so consistent with long-standing ideas of economic independence. So what happens during the New Deal? And this is where maybe my argument's going to get a bit polemical, but FDR is facing significant pressure from his left. And one of the ways to stave off a much more wholesale discussion about the inherent nature of, let's say, the capitalist economic system is by focusing on taxation. And so FDR claims and appropriates the language of economic royalism, which had been the bread and butter of class politics in the preceding 3+ decades, as a way of focusing on what the problem of capitalism consists in. And the problem is a matter of corruption and the aristocratic pretensions of a very small few, the problem of the 1%. And notice that at that moment, this is actually a domestication of class politics. It's a transformation of a class politics that's much more widespread into a single focus on a small group that embody a set of feudal values that are inconsistent with the rest of American values. Something to think about the use of the rhetoric of the 1% and the ways in which perhaps this too represents a much more domesticated version of class politics. So what's the effect? The effect is a set of policies that succeed. They succeed in smashing the great fortunes, and along with economic growth, creating conditions in the mid-20th century where, a large number of liberals that are part of the New Deal coalition, that become part of, let's say, the managerial elite in the 40s and 50s, can say the problem of capitalism has been solved. It was a problem of a bad minority of few, a problem of corrupt oligarchies, not something that's endemic to the system. And then, against the backdrop of the Cold War, the sense that the problem of capitalism has been solved also shifted the lines of analysis about who counts as a domestic enemy as opposed to ally. And the increasing view among liberals that are even part of the New Deal coalition is that class politics is problematic, and that the real enemies are folks in the labor movement and other elements of, let's say, radical left coalitions that are committed to much more aggressive efforts to transform the economy, because this links up with the kind of politics that you see in the Soviet Union and elsewhere. And actually, capitalists, the 1%, if anything, are allies. They're Americans, they're entrepreneurs, they're wealth creators and generators. And over the course of really from basically 45 until the 80s, 90s, you see a steady reduction in these marginal tax rates when it comes to both income and also estate. And you also see a steady elimination of the kind of class politics that marked the moment when the New Deal was actually a labor coalition, and instead a focus on class conciliation and consensus. And so when we get to the 90s, you have very low marginal tax rates, and if anything, this is a story where by the 90s, these low marginal tax rates create perverse incentives, precisely the high compensation packages that generate massive inequalities today. And so even with the return of a kind of class politics through Occupy, you still don't have anything like the political will within the Democratic Party to address issues of inequality. And you can think of this for three reasons. First, if you think of the Occupy framing of 1% as itself a domesticated form of the class politics that marked the first 3-4 decades of the 20th century, then the fact that that marks like the far extreme of what's acceptable tells you that the focus on thinking of wealth as a site of real contestation between haves and have-nots is just it's not on the cards within what remains of the Democratic Party, the kind of New Deal coalition. The second has to do with the nature of the super rich today, who don't really have anything like the kind of aristocratic pretensions that I described as marking the Vanderbilts and the Rockefellers. So, you know, you might have the same degree of inequality, the same degree of economic and political power in practice, but you don't have the ostentatiousness that raises the ire, let's say, of Republican values. And then the third point, which I think in many ways is the most important, is that there's a story of meritocracy that you can tell about income inequality, where rather than this being an issue of illegitimate feudal enrichment, it's tied to the just deserts that are provided to those that are most talented in an economy that's based on merit, and that reaches not just, you know, corporate managers, but also other kinds of professional elites. So what does that tell us about the present moment? First, it says there was a bargain struck in the 40s, where in some ways, all of the big structural questions of economic practice were removed from the table with a single focus on tax policy. And the long-term trend has been the steady reduction of even that focus on tax policy. So we're now in a moment where you don't have the larger possibilities that were imagined in the first third of the 20th century, or the kind of confiscatory tax regime that produced greater forms of equality. And this leads, I think, to two real ironies with Piketty's book. The first is, at least for the American example, the singular emphasis on taxation means calling for a set of policies in the present that were tried in the past, in the mid-20th century, and that through a series of dynamics, unwittingly actually helped facilitate precisely the type of problem that we see today with dramatic forms of inequality that now Piketty is saying let's solve by doing what we did in the 40s. And so that there's a cycle here that raises real questions about the utility of focusing on taxation alone. This does not mean, of course, that progressive taxation isn't something that could be essential, but it has to be part of a broader set of programmatic efforts to actually constrain and alter the nature of the economy in a much more fundamental way. And that leads to maybe the second irony, which is the power of the book has to do with the sense that traditional economists, really Bob excluded, failed in addressing the basic problems of global capitalism, and that the kinds of solutions that they offered helped generate the problems that we see today. And so that there's a thirst for thinking big and thinking in systematic and structural terms. And if anything, when it comes to the politics of the solutions that Piketty offers, he's not too utopian, he's not utopian enough. It's actually relatively narrow. It's a politics of silver bulletism that focuses on an incredibly arcane area that's technical, that's been the site of elites, and that's been easily susceptible to manipulation by those that are economically privileged precisely because of how insulated it is. And so thinking of taxation as a silver bullet without also focusing on, you know, expanding the democratization of finance capital through things like employee stock option programs, but other forms of stock option programs that focus on consumers or citizens. This is the kind of work that my colleague Bob Hockett has been doing, or thinking about a basic income or full employment or a number of other, really, I think, more structural solutions, leads us to a kind of contemporary moment where we say, well, what options are there? And it also suggests, I think, in the final analysis, that the way to address this is, again, through politics, through reviving class contestation, class consciousness, and rebuilding the classic social bases that made possible the conversations that marked the first 3-4 decades of the 20th century.
Okay, the concept of the afternoon is a robust discussion, as I said earlier. So we will begin. Of course, the guy in the back is the first guy to raise his hand. But meantime, I think there was a fantastic series of ideas that span the range of the book, and I was impressed by both the respect everybody brought to the text as well as a critical gaze.
Okay, thanks, Jeff. I'm Lowell Turner from the ILR School, also the Worker Institute. Great panel. I'm also a big fan of this book. I think it's a major contribution, and I don't think it's being overplayed. I do think that ever since the financial crash and then Occupy, that inequality has been moving up on the radar screen. I teach a class on the politics of inequality that had 180 students this semester, and that was before Pikketty became a phenomenon. He's riding a wave, and he's coming along just at the right time. The one criticism I have of this book is, and this is always the problem with brilliant analyses like this, is that when they get to their solutions, there's the same problem with Stiglitz and Karl Marx and all kinds of people. But, the idea of I'm all in favor of a progressive consumption tax, for example, and we read Frank's article on our syllabus. But these are top-down solutions that are not going to happen until the politics change. And this is, I'd like to build on the final comment there, which I think was spot on, that you can make things more equal by taxing the rich, or you can make things more equal by bringing up the lower end. And I think we're seeing a remarkable phenomenon in this country now, and this is the spread of the alt-labor movement that we're called. And we talk about the labor movement, we talk about traditional unions, but if you add in the fast food strikes, our Walmart, the National Domestic Workers Alliance, a whole range of things that are happening now. We have a much bigger labor movement, a revitalized labor movement in this country, that much more so than we've had in the last 20 years. The energy behind the minimum wage campaigns that are spreading like wildfire in states and cities is being driven by by an alliance, really, between the alt-labor movement and the traditional labor movement, and a whole coalition of other organizations, immigrant rights groups, social justice NGOs, and so on. And I think pushing up from the bottom is the first way we reduce inequality, and it's also the way we build the mobilization capacity to then change policy at the top, to then change policies such as our tax structure. And Pikketty ends up by advocating his global, progressive global income tax, but then he sort of says, well, but that's a utopian idea. And he does what all of us social scientists, the big mistake we always make is to extrapolate into the future, and it's going to be the same as the present. And it doesn't have to be that way. He's only utopian because he only sees himself as utopian because he doesn't see what really I think is the best solution now, which is pushing things up from the bottom to gain the political power and leverage to then change things in our tax structure and in our economic policies.
I actually have an old-fashioned question.
Wait 1 second. So. Thank you.
Like Bob, I've read half the book, but unlike him, I have not understood Law 2. The question is, all of you agree that the analysis is correct. You disagree about what should be done. And my question is, what, if anything, is likely to happen in the present scheme of political thought in America?
I think our best hope is to persuade those at the top, the ones who think they're benefiting from current arrangements, to try and make clear to them that they're not benefiting at all under those arrangements. I think I had a conversation with one of my colleagues. He said, did I know that Obama was planning to raise this tax, that tax, the other tax? And I said, no, I didn't know that. And he seemed shocked. I didn't know it. you want to know why I don't know that? He said, yeah. I said, because if you think about it, it doesn't really matter whether he raises those taxes. What do you mean? And I said, look, is there any chance he's going to raise the tax rate by enough that you and I wouldn't be able to get what we need? And, no, that's not going to happen. He has a successful textbook. I've written a textbook. You know, we're not at risk of not getting what we need. So what's at risk? Whether we can get what we want. And I think the natural way to think about when your tax rate goes up, oh, then I'll have less money. I'll be able to get less of what I want. That's true when you have less money. But what about if we have less money because our tax rates went up? That means you have less and I have less. I said, for people like us, what we want is the kind of stuff that there's not enough of, so we have to bid for it. And if I'm bidding against you for a lot with a view of the lake, and there's only one of them, who gets that lot doesn't depend on how much absolute income we bring to the contest. It's our relative income. And so if we're each paying slightly higher taxes, the lot's going to end up in the same hands as it would have before that. Meantime, we don't have to drive on these roads that have foot-deep potholes everywhere in them. And he just walked away. He didn't like that, but it's not a complicated idea. You know, when everybody builds a bigger mansion, when everybody spends more on his daughter's wedding, it just raises the bar that defines how much you need to spend on such things. There's no gain from that. And diverting those funds into other things would be good not just for the poor. You could help them with income support measures, but it would also be good for the rich, because the public sphere has gone to hell in the last 40 years. With the low tax rates, we can't fix the bridges, the roads, the schools are going to pot. You know, we can't afford teachers or to fix leaky roofs. That's a bad package for the rich, even if they send their kids to private school, because they need to hire workers that have learned something, and the schools aren't producing that.
Yeah.
So in a way, this, I guess, connects to both of the comments that, you know, let's say the problem that I have with the part 4 of the book is that, in a way, it attempts to short-circuit the hard work of politics. And it does it in a couple different ways. One is through imagining that there's some kind of policy silver bullet, so that if elites in Davos or wherever else are able to come together and agree on a very minimal progressive tax on capital, then that's going to short-circuit the basic problems that have emerged. Or through a kind of determinism, that actually what's generated, and this is something that Ed was emphasizing, like what's generated the moments of greater equality in the past have been massive external shocks, so that there isn't a ton that we can actually do in practice through things like organizing. And my basic view is that actually politics has been pretty central to the rise of what amounted to a kind of long exception or golden age in the mid-20th century in the U.S. And that the problem of the present in the U.S. has to do with both for structural reasons, but also as a result of political victory and defeat, the demobilization of the kind of social bases that actually could sustain the types of policies that we'd want. So everything from the labor movement to the civil rights movement. And the contemporary problem of the present is, you know, thinking seriously about, well, where will alternative social bases emerge? So that there's immigration and immigrant labor, but there's always the problem of the fact that, you know, you have communities that face real coercive pressure through deportation and detention schemes. There's the labor movement that's been rolled back in various ways for extended periods of time. There's the old civil rights movement, but the old civil rights movement is now cut through various kinds of class cleavages. And all of these are actually like the real problems that we face. And in a sense, this means to me that the book is both not utopian enough in terms of imagining actual structural alternatives, and not pessimistic enough in terms of giving an adequate account of the political circumstances, and so thinking seriously about, well, what would a politics in the future look like? And, you know, this can devolve into just another conversation about what happened to the left, but in many ways, the political question is a version of that in the States. And this is one of the reasons why I'm a little bit suspicious of sort of either the politics of silver bullets or even a class politics that focuses too exclusively on the 1%.
If I could.
I'll
take it later.
Ed, go ahead. There we go. Ed.
Oh, go ahead. No, I want to push back just a little bit against the panelists, because I think that identifying wealth as the sort of analytical problem, if you will, measuring it, tracking it, as opposed to other potential categories of equality and inequality, I think it's significant. I too share skepticism of the sort of silver bullet quality of a progressive tax on wealth. I want to give him a little bit of a pass, and that I think that there's also a good bit of irony in the book, and there are many sections where he seems to move rather ironically on past what would have to be major mountains of organization and political victory. Of course, you can disagree with it, with that reading, but I think he's not entirely unaware of those challenges. But going back to wealth, I think that a tax on wealth, especially a progressive one, on the categories of financial wealth in particular that generate abnormally high returns, would be really significant in shifting investment in the United States and other industrial democracies away from these sort of exotic and often highly unethical ways of earning big returns, and into the actual processes of employment, investment and production, and all of these kinds of things that would increase the standard of living for workers in all kinds of ways. How it's going to be imposed and achieved, I think, is a whole other story that you're right, he sort of forecloses or skips over.
There's already an interesting tension developing, I think, between changing the minds of the elites and pushing up from below that's developing in the room that I think is fascinating. Yes?
Thank you so much for these presentations.
It doesn't amplify, it's just for the online.
Okay. So I'll try to raise my voice. So thank you so much. I learned a lot from all of you. I guess I wanted to follow up on Professor Frank's comments, but picking up on an observation that Professor Rana made at the end of your remarks about meritocracy as it relates to corporate pay. So the increase in corporate pay being one of the components that the author identified as contributing to increasing economic inequality. And you described it as a function of meritocracy. And I thought it was helpful that you sort of turned our attention away from the conspicuous examples of CEOs that really fail to do their jobs as they've been defined, and pointed to the sort of structural factors that would create rewards for executives that are able to really generate returns to shareholders. But I guess my question for you would be whether the return to shareholders, whether that concept is completely synonymous with the idea of meritocracy. In other words, would a more precise definition for what you're describing be CEOs who can increase returns to shareholders, some portion of the population of which thinks is meritocratic and beneficial, but many other people are quite critical of this trend in the way that corporate governance is conducted. So I guess my question for you would be, would you agree that a more descriptive account and a less normative one in the change in corporate pay would be not so much meritocratic, but corporate executives who can increase return to shareholders? So that's the first question. The second question would be, is following on the structural analysis, is that a consequence of increased fluidity and integration of capital markets in the global economy, which might generate its own sort of competitive pressures on corporations to retain shareholders by increasing dividends? And if so, is there a structural contributor to these increases in corporate pay? And if that's the case, is there a structural solution? In other words, so this would be part of an analysis that tries to reconfigure goals of corporate governance to think about issues other than returns to shareholders, like employer well-being, environmental sustainability, so just a completely different focus on what it means to run a corporation well.
Yeah, those are great questions to pose, and there's a lot of work being done on exactly that kind of inquiry. The triple bottom line movement, even in the narrow context of shareholder return maximization, there are broader concerns that creep in automatically. Consumers seem to care about what kind of methods the firms use that they buy from. So if the tuna supplier uses nets that kill dolphins, consumers, contrary to what economists predict, are willing to switch from the low-cost tuna that's available from those suppliers to higher-cost tuna that uses fishing methods that don't kill dolphins. Workers care about what their companies do. If you write ad copy for RJR, you'll insist on a higher rate of pay than if you write ad copy for the American Cancer Society urging teenagers not to start smoking rather than trying to get them to start smoking. So there are lots of ways that broader concerns are built in, even to the sort of unregulated shareholder maximization model. But corporate governance is very much in a state of flux right now. They're looking for ways to try to get the broader community better represented. In Europe, I know they have mandates that labor unions and other community stakeholders be represented on corporate boards. It's a very imperfect process, this kind of quest to figure out how to run big corporations. And I think there are some signs of encouraging progress in it. Apple used to be hammered for its environmentally unfriendly ways. Now they've got every one of their server farms is powered by either solar or some other renewable source of energy, wind. The companies seem aware that people are concerned about that. Does every high salary represent value added? No. Again, it's a you don't know how productive an executive is going to be. You try to find the best executive you can. You make the hire. There's a going rate. If the organization is bigger and more important, the going rate is higher than if it's a small organization. And then you see how the executive does, and you get rid of the executive if the performance isn't there. That's kind of the crude groping process that I see going on. But the main thing is there's no economic argument not for taxing these huge salaries. And caps on executive pay don't seem like a sensible route to take. That's been proposed often. Why do we want to encourage people not to become managers and instead to become personal injury lawyers or hedge fund operators or cosmetic surgeons? I mean, there are lots of high incomes out there besides managers' incomes, and they're so high, these superstar salaries, that qualified people show up in a superabundance to compete for those slots. We don't need so many competing to be hedge fund managers. If more of them became scientists, that would be better. 44% of Princeton's graduating class in 2007 took a job in the financial services industry. I mean, those are the smartest kids we have, and they should be studying to be doctors or scientists or engineers or something besides hedge fund managers.
Can I just, yeah, so I mean, I also do, on the point about meritocracy, I mean, I do think that there's a broader, let's say, cultural problem, which is, so Pikketty notes that, let's say, if you had really high marginal tax rates up above 500,000, pretty soon, you know, CEOs wouldn't have those kinds of compensation schemes, and that actually the folks that would end up getting hit are people that are making incomes that are essentially like 200,000 plus. And that starts to reach not just the 1%, but actually the top decile. And part of the cultural context in which those kinds of policies would operate is one where that top decile aren't just CEO managers, but also a broader professional elite that's been taught through elite universities that I attended, that we're part of here, that actually, through education, success in education, and the kinds of professional jobs you get, that the income is a product of your own capacity and skill, and that inequality is something that, in effect, is natural. And if that's the broader culture that affects the top 10% who, you know, for Pikketty, have 70% plus of the national wealth and equivalent amounts of national income, then it's going to be very difficult to think in terms of the types of tax policy that I think that he describes because it's not just an issue of the super rich, it's an issue of a kind of general climate about just desert.
No, but there's a very important distinction between whether these people are adding economic value in rough proportion to the big salaries that they're being paid. I think on balance, that's where things tend. It's obviously highly imperfect, but the question of whether such big salaries are necessary to produce the kind of output that we enjoy, there's no evidence for that. Economic theory makes no prediction about what will happen if your per hour after-tax rate of pay goes down. There are two competing effects, and historically, the tendency has been to work longer hours if your rate of after-tax pay goes down, not shorter hours. So whether these incomes are merited or not doesn't really matter.
So, I mean, my view is
they're way
clearly
more than
not.
anyone needs. We know in other countries people work hard without such high rates of pay. You can tax all these salaries at a much higher rate without causing any damage and raising some revenue that you need to solve some problems.
There's also another question of meritocracy, which has to do with the universities, and Pikketty has some really interesting comments, but hopefully we'll get to those.
Well, I'd like to key off what Bob says a little bit on the matter of these superstar salaries in Pikketty's book. I got a chance to read Pikketty's book on the plane going to my daughter in Ethiopia, taking her dog tour, and she was one of that Princeton class of 2007 who did not go into finance. So anyway, but one of the things that Pikketty, I think, doesn't do is separate out the superstar salaries from the high executive salaries. When I couldn't see him making a separate category for that particularly spectacular class. But I'd like to bring a little bit of personal history in there also, since I was in France in 1968 and saw that, as well as I think I'm the only faculty member who actually attended meetings of Occupy Cornell. So I have that sort of perspective of these two reform movements. And what we learned, in a sense, from Occupy Cornell, I suppose, was that they were able to popularize the idea of 1% and to focus on income and on income inequality, or wealth inequality, however you want to interpret the 1%. On the other hand, what really went on, and I think it's a way of looking at the Occupy movement, is there was something else going on. They had an idea of justice and of democratization that were much broader than simply reforming the distribution of wealth and income. There were all kinds of other things, and not just, in fact, turning to more public sector involvement. But the way they ran the meetings reminded me a lot of the way meetings happened in Paris in 1968, an emphasis upon radically democratic decentralization, upon letting everyone sort of have a say, and so forth, anyway. And it was that sort of, to quote Kwame Nkrumah, they were seeking first the political kingdom. I mean, that's what they really tried to do there. And I said that should be kept in mind when we talk about the sort of outcomes that we'd like to see after looking at Pikketty's solutions as well.
While Mike is being moved, if there's anybody in the room that wants to take on that the idea of inequality is actually a problem, I would actually like to hear that. I mean, that the group is presuming it is. I would invite alternative voices. Yeah.
And that's a perfect lead. You anticipated my question. And it's a question of the panel not having had a chance to read the book, but only reviews. I recall that 50 years ago, most books about capitalism by economists sang the praises of the synergy between markets and democracy, the form of government and freedom. The implications of inequality that are in this book and recent decisions by the Supreme Court suggest potential moves in another direction. Does the author anywhere give any allusion to the linkage that this increasing inequality might have on the form of government and democratization in the various societies?
He says that it essentially hollows out democracy and makes it into a pretense. So there's a certain tipping point beyond, and he doesn't identify that, but there's a certain tipping point at which it's no longer democratic, but it's just an attempt to build a coalition that will support the interests of the top 1% or whatever market. But the other thing that's interesting is that there are numerous points in the book where he says, you know, what's going on here, the product of the increasing concentration of wealth and the ways in which greater concentrations of wealth are able to find their own sub-pockets of higher rates of return through secrecy and through closed markets and so on. It's not actually the free market either. And these processes of concentration of wealth and perpetuation of inequality don't necessarily lead to greater extent of market processes as determining features in the economy. And they don't even have to exist in a market economy. There are other kinds of economies they can exist in. So there's no necessary correlation between the presence of inequality and the presence of markets.
He also, I mean, one of the great things about being able to go back 200 plus years and looking at sort of state and tax and estate records is he explodes the myth that, let's say, the kinds of liberalization policies pursued more recently by Reagan and Margaret Thatcher actually ended up generating greater forms of growth. That, in point of fact, something like extreme growth is really, really low. It's more like 1.5%, 1 to 1.5%. That what you can think of as supply-side economics or all of the kinds of policies really had only a marginal effect on growth, and that instead the story is with the sort of end of the post-war period, growth rates declining. His view, they're probably going to stay between 1 and 1.5%, and if you have really high returns to capital, it'll just produce inequality without any actual tangible benefit for, let's say, the people at the bottom. And so you have the democracy problems, but you also don't necessarily have the prosperity that's supposed to be produced by you know, greater concentration of wealth in small hands.
Actually, it's worse than that, because I think the conventional measures of growth just put output times its price and add all that up, and if it goes up 3%, that's growth, but that's not what we really care about. What we really care about is how much the stuff we produce makes us better off. And what there's been is a real shift in the composition of output away from the things that most ordinary people buy, which I think in general can be presumed to make them better off, to more and bigger for the people at the top. And there's really no evidence at all that when every person in the top 1/10 of 1% builds a bigger mansion, that anybody's any happier as a result of that. It just raises the bar that defines how big a mansion somebody in that part of the income distribution is expected or feels he needs to have. And so that's counted as growth, but it's not growth at all. And anything we care about, it's total waste. And there's just example after example of that sort. So I think that's the part that Piketty doesn't focus on or think about, but I think that's the real waste in the tendency for incomes to concentrate at the top.
Sir.
Oh, yeah, sure. So I also have to confess I didn't read the book because it's sold out on Amazon. But I guess my question is sort of like Professor Baptist's point about different kinds of equality is sort of particularly salient, right? Because there's not just one sort of monolithic version of capital. There are multiple different kinds of capital. So I was wondering whether Pikketty or like whether you think that like the nature of capital in the 21st century has really changed, even though he has a sort of like historical analysis of how like capital necessarily, you know, like the rate of growth versus like the rate of capital, return on capital or whatnot, but whether like the globalized economy or like the merging of capital markets necessarily makes it more fluid or makes it a lot more difficult to sort of create tackle this problem.
So, I mean, one thing that he focuses on about the American example, so the big thing that distinguishes the U.S. from Europe in the 19th century for white men in the U.S. is the story of territorial expansion, which is one of conquest and dispossession of native peoples, and that provides large swaths of land that can then be the basis of a broad distribution of essentially property and homesteading. And so agricultural land is relatively broadly distributed among white men. It reduces let's say, income and wealth inequalities in the U.S., but I think for kind of classic Republican values, it does something more, which is it means that you have an ethic of economic independence, that people actually can control the conditions of their own work. They learn a set of practices through work that produce a moral economy that's consistent with democratic self-rule, and that sort of fulfills a particular vision of equality that marked American politics. And in many ways, I think the contemporary problem is that the various 20th century equivalents to the 19th century homestead and the general provision of land are no longer on offer in quite the same way. So the classic 20th century equivalents had to do with collective bargaining, increased wages for workers, access to university education, things like the GI Bill, but the general provision of education. So education and work in the 20th century as a basis of, again, providing the same forms of equality. And we're struggling really in the 21st century with thinking about equivalence. And those equivalents are going to have to come to grips with the nature of finance capital and imagine ways to both democratize capital in terms of making it more broadly accessible, but also produce the kind of ethical practices that marked American politics in the 19th and mid-20th. Now, I mentioned him earlier, but my colleague Bob Hockett at the law school, this is a lot of what he's thinking about now, which is imagining ways to democratize finance capital. That's a little bit above my pay grade, but that's in some ways the contemporary problem.
Okay. This right. And then John.
So I'm curious. I haven't gotten to the end either.
There's no.
But I pick up from the reviews and from what you said that there's a international coordination to this progressive tax, which is necessary. I take it universally that there would have to be a coordinated international effort if it was to be on the taxation side. And since some more radical proposals have been discussed and that the taxation piece is actually quite a small piece, I'm curious, given the geographic globalization of capital today, how the international element affects political action and therefore, I guess my question assumes probably a negative effect. What are the prospects of kind of truly building international coordination to fix this system? Because I would imagine, and a pro-growth conservative would tell you that it can't. If you just fix the U.S. story, capital would go somewhere else. I'd be interested to know your thoughts on that.
So he certainly implies that I suppose you'd have to go to Davos and convince everybody there it was a great idea, or some sort of process like that where you'd get global elites to buy in. But the thing that's sort of sneaky about the argument for a global tax on capital is that it necessitates a much broader enumeration, a much broader census of wealth than exists even in one country today. And of course, if such a census is created, if such an enumeration is created, then information will presumably be relatively freely available. And whether maybe I won't know specifically what you own, right? Although some bureaucrat somewhere will know much more about what you own than they know now. But we will be able to understand the distribution of wealth much more clearly. And that understanding, that knowledge, that information will be available for political activism in a new way that might even undermine the rule of Davos that brought us to that point. And I think that's imagining that as part of why he says, well, this is a little bit utopian, right? Seeing all of these pieces fitting together in the future might be an unlikely scenario. But it is, I think, a bit more radical than we've been giving him credit for.
No, I mean, it's certainly true that the kind of practical thing that he ends up really calling for is banking transparency. And in a way, you can think of that not unlike the kinds of small-scale reforms that labor activists and various social movements pressed for that saw those reforms as clear stepping stones. So if there's actually far greater banking transparency across the EU, so let's say instead of globally focus on the EU, that could transform the nature of the political conversation people have about wealth and inequality.
Yeah, I'm chiming in on that really quickly, though. If you think about the micro level of this question and how race works, how important religion is in politics, how diffuse class consciousness is today, and the role of all of these things, it's hard enough to get a domestic agenda, let alone catapulting that into a global scale, especially when globalization seems to push back on a certain ethno-nationalist response. So it's the micro dimensions of this, of the politics of this, are extremely complicated. All right, we have one more question. Super brief answers will come.
Okay. I have first a study that I think you've probably heard of. Two political scientists have looked at what determined 5,000 policy decisions in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s in the United States. And they measured the attitude or belief of policy preferences of the 50th percentile of the distribution and the 90th percentile of the of the income distribution's views. They also had the views of business lobbyists, and they had an index of their positions. Sometimes they disagreed. And then they had the rest of the lobbyists, AARP, the labor union movement, the environmental movement, and so forth. Well, these things are correlated, but the 90th percentile of income, their views, was the single best predictor. The next best predictor was the business lobbyists, that variable, and essentially the 50th percentile gets disappears in competition with the others. And there's a great weakness in terms of the ability of this other group, of which the left, unions, and AARP, and civil rights organizations, and environmental organizations. So basically, this is not going to happen unless the political power of new people, people with the kinds of views in this room, it goes up relative to the political power of the way this is, and it's not. I mean, we just see the Democratic Party has sort of has to get all this money from the finance industry in order to finance their campaigns, and so they can't even pass something so obvious like a slightly higher marginal tax rate on parity interest. It's ridiculous. So the solution is really we have to change the political power of people who make arguments, and they're often very technical arguments because it's fights over very esoteric tax positions and policies that are implemented in international treaty organizations. For example, the one that's being created for the Pacific and the one that's being created for the Atlantic. And it's those decisions, getting cooperation across countries to have higher marginal tax rates and not have Ireland be the place where everyone sends their profits because they have a lower rate. And if Ireland raises it, there's still Luxembourg, or there's another country that will do the same.
Okay, well, that's an interesting set of dilemmas to end on. And I want to thank the panelists very much, and all you for staying to the bitter end. So thank you very much.
Oh, the end wasn't so bitter.